Thank you. And so welcome to Active Travel Cafe on the 25th of June 2024. Welcome from what has been dubbed in the last week the wokest city in the country, Oxford. And it's a bit too hot for me to be wearing my corduroy trousers, which I hadn't rated as woke, but I have been out on my Brompton bike today. And before I tuck into my vegetarian curry, I am flying a pride flag in the window. So welcome to the Active Travel Cafe for the evening. And we're really tackling a important topic today, road danger reduction and the politics of road death. And we've got a great speaker lined up, Dr. Ian Greenwood, who's been very active in both analysing statistics and thinking about the politics and issues behind road death. So I'm really looking forward to his talk there. And that will be followed by our very favourite ranty highwayman, Mark Philpott, talking about another issue of the good, the bad and the interesting of infrastructure. But we'll start as ever with crowdsourced news. So who would like to take to the floor? And it's the very other side of the blues. Roxanne from Cambridge. What have you got, Roxanne?
Hi everyone. It's more a request, I suppose, than news. I'm not even meant to be here today. I've just had to pop in to make this request. CamCycle is having some interesting times with our insurers, and it sounds like we're not the only cycling activity related organization that is finding themselves in this kind of pickle. So just a request to everyone else in this network, if you could go and have a look at your insurers and your upcoming renewal dates, and maybe get in touch with me if you foresee that you might also be encountering an issue. This is related to anything to do with bike rides. So we're all facing a world where the only way you can be insured for any bike ride is if you are completely helmeted, high-vised, permission slipped, contracted, all the bells and whistles, in a way that I know the people in this meeting think we shouldn't go. I think this might go beyond events, and just any organization that has people cycling in some way related to work might also be getting impacted by this. So I'm just rallying as many stakeholders and organizations as I can to get in touch, and let's turn this into a campaign, because I think a number of us will look at having to shut down significant parts of our activities if we can't get an appropriate kind of insurance, and right now there's nothing on the market. So very frustrating time. Get in touch if you think you might face the same, or you might have a solution. So that's my news for the day. Thanks. I have to jump off in 2 more minutes to have a phone call about this. I can see Ruth might have something to say.
Ruth is waving in a way that suggests she's got a comment directly on this. So we'll do Ruth next.
Yeah, thanks. So Nationwide brought this in a while ago in their insurance policy, and I've forgotten who it was with, because I have my insurance with Nationwide, and they insisted that cycling had to be helmeted and blah, 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 blah. I think lots and lots of people wrote into them, and they revised it by saying only if you were racing or mountain biking, as in that kind of thing. So for normal cycling, because I explained that I travel to Holland a lot, where you don't have to wear a helmet, it isn't mandatory. So for my travel insurance, they did waive it, and I think they waived it through whoever their broker, or I've forgotten what the technical word is. So it's worth actually that, as well as bringing it in what kind of cycling.
I'll be clear. Definitely, Ruth, have gone through all of that. This is sort of like an issue that's come back again.
Okay.
So and this is organizational insurance, not individual.
Okay. No. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Roger, thank you. I see your comments, Roger. That's not working. All the known paths to resolve this have been shut down. So anyone that is looking at renewing, this has just come up in the last month. It seems to change. So go and check, because I think we'll find everyone's about to be hit by this. Yeah. Sorry.
That's deeply concerning. I mean, the normal route's been to affiliate your group to Cycling UK or British Cycling, but okay.
I don't think that's going to work. I think this is going to hit them too if we don't do something. So I'll be talking to them.
Very, yeah. Katie will be very worried about this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. H.
I was going to pick up on the insurance. I was trying to get on today. Everybody's raging about car insurance as well, because nobody is managing it by risk. And the radio was on to you and yours saying, how can you afford car insurance? And my answer was, well, get rid of the car. And wherever you look in the media, nobody is suggesting get rid of the car.
I think that's a point that we should make.
Well, I mean, basically, I haven't owned a car for 48 years. And my motoring costs over the past 6 years have been under 500 quid inclusive, all costs paid, and I just use my bus pass to hire cars. There are a few people taking this up, but we need to get this more publicity. I'll send somebody to CamCycle, Roxanne, to catch up with this insurance campaign as well, because the more we look at risk management, and Bob Davis is probably going to come in on this, if we can eliminate risk and insist that we only operate with 100% safe in blue zone, then we should have lower insurance.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else who wants to follow with any other news? John Morris, you've got a physical hand up.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Very loud and clear.
Good. Yeah, from a sunny Cambridgeshire. I've just put something in the chat, actually. It was just to alert you to the fact that we're holding a candle, and it's very appropriate that your discussion tonight is about the politics of road death, because we're holding a candlelight vigil this Saturday night in Huntingdon at 10 o'clock in honour of Mike Goff, one of our founder members and a well-known road safety campaigner. Mike was tragically knocked off his bicycle, or shall I say, in a collision with a motor vehicle in March, and died as a result from that collision. And the driver has been arrested on suspicion of causing death by careless driving. So we're holding this vigil on Saturday with Mike's wife and family. It'll be quite an emotional event. And if you're not able to join us, please join us in a minute's silence at 10:30 p.m. on Saturday night. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. And okay, any other hands going up? No. Okay. H, is it very quick? You've already had one.
Supplement that by, at any inquest, whether anything is done to look at the causes and removal of the causes. I bang on about Section 39. I would dearly love to sack all the road safety teams and employ experts in risk management, which is how the air industry does it, the rail industry does it, and the marine industry does it.
So I would note that the can we call them outgoing government? Possibly outgoing government. Actually, 2 years ago, proposed a road safety investigation branch and then hasn't followed through on them. I think we ought to be campaigning for that to be followed through, because that might lead to that kind of approach. And I'm sure if they were any good, they would recommend all kinds of positive things, even if they were called road safety, not road danger reduction. I was going to mention one thing which might be a useful resource to lots of people. Sport England have published the data behind their active lives survey. They do this in a kind of interactive database form. So if you search for active lives online, you'll go to a website which has a set of data that can be searched by activity, geographical area, and type of people, like male, female, ethnic groups, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, you can't do all three at once. You've got to pick two combinations, but that will still give you quite a lot of information about cycling and walking in your particular geographic area and the trends in it over 6 or 7 years now. So that's a really useful resource for seeing what's happening in your local area. And so I'll bring the news to an end there, unless anyone's got last desperate hand. Good. And then go on to Ian Greenwood. So, as I say, road danger reduction has been, thanks to Dr. Bob Davis, one of the founding features of Active Travel Cafe, or Ideas with Beers as it was then. And I think for many of us, it's a constant feature. I mean, even in the last week, we've had 3 people cycling in and around Oxford injured, one of whom was a traffic officer working on highways officer working on traffic reduction schemes, ironically, and one of whom was the leader of the city council, who's a keen supporter of them. So this continues to be a key issue. And Ian contacted, after making contact, really seeing his campaigns and analysis on Twitter. So hopefully Twitter redeems itself a small amount, and really interested to hear his point of view tonight. Over to you, Ian.
Robin, thank you. Is the technology working? Can people see or hear me?
Yes, and I think if I'm going to try and highlight you for, yes, Spotlight for Everyone, I think brings you up large. Yeah, brilliant.
As well. And Robin, 15 minutes max, I think, is the rule. Is that right?
Yep, 15 minutes and then Q&A.
Yep. So hello, everybody. Robin, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really good to, I can't really see anybody, but it's really good to be with you today. My background is a bit eclectic, so the headlines are basically fourfold. I started off life as a children's nurse, ended up working in trauma, then ended up running big bits of the NHS hospitals, including trauma services. Secondly, I've done lots of academic work. My PhD was called The Politics of Road Death, which I'll talk to you about today. And don't worry, it's not too academic. I've tried to pick out some things I thought you might think interesting. Thirdly, tragically, my 12-year-old daughter was killed in a car crash in 2008 with her sister, who was seriously injured, but thankfully now is 22 and very well, thank you. So now I'm a full-time campaigner, and I campaign to stop road death and reduce road danger. So what I thought I'd do today was essentially 3 things. I can't do justice to my own work, so I have been selective. So really happy to engage in a debate, an argument, a discussion, whatever, afterwards, particularly if I miss anything. So what I did was the politics of road death, which I'll talk to you about a little bit on the methodology, but as I say, don't worry too much, it won't be too academic. Secondly, describe a little bit of a model that I used about policy problems, policy solutions, and the politics stream. It's called the multiple streams model, which I found really helpful. I think it's a really useful model in which to frame road danger, road death, and I'd be interested in your views on that. And I will focus on a couple of areas. One is the difference between what we need to do and how we need to do it. And secondly, about framing and the language that we use, which is important in terms of the academic stuff in public policy terms, but also just in day-to-day life, how we describe things is really quite important. So the starting point for my own work was wanting to know why, and kind of why I was questioning, why did we in Britain not seem to take road death, road danger, road safety policy seriously enough. You will all know the data for the last decade or so. You will also all know the data from the previous couple of decades, where we saw significant reductions in the numbers of people killed or seriously injured. So something obviously changed, and I was interested in understanding the whole role of the politics of this, but also the how and why we can do something about this. So I focused on macro level or strategic level policy making, although I did 2 detailed case studies, one of which was young drivers, the second of which is rural roads. And you will all know, I'm sure, that there's a very clear connection between young drivers travelling on on rural roads. So I didn't get into particular modes. I didn't get into particular whether there's different types of vehicle or cyclists or vulnerable road users. I stuck to the strategic level other than those the two exceptions. So the multiple streams model was developed by a professor of politics in the States called John Kingdon. And I will say a little bit about that in terms of how I applied that. What I did was a comparative documentary assessment, analysis, and interviews. I interviewed 35 willing participants. 35 people said no to me, interestingly. And I basically did the documentary analysis over 3 decades, which included transport committee inquiries, reviewing Hansard, and policy documents over that period. I basically found strong evidence in different periods of policy action and policy inaction, which I don't have time to go into share with you today in any detail. But in the analysis, I've essentially developed or gathered a full chronology from 87 to 2021, based on the criteria that I've shared, looking at what policymakers did or indeed didn't do. And one of the kind of the lenses is how do we make policy happen? Why does it not happen? Or in some cases, why is it just completely ignored and doesn't even get onto the policy agenda at all? One of the flavors, which I'll come back to, is the rise in the kind of the libertarian ideals around mobility and how over time that has become more political. And more recently, it does seem that whilst you can have, I think, a reasonable debate about whether you support freedom and being a liberal, a libertarian, but when it is warped and only favours certain populations, I think then we end up with a problem. So maybe one of the things you want to talk about. One of the strong senses was the framing and the impact, the language that's used. What the public policy academics talk about is the policy image, and the language is really quite important in how you frame the policy image and the venues in which that language is used. And I argue that there's a very strong, particularly in the last 15, possibly even 20 years, that the job has been done. The framing of, well, we've not really got a problem here, have we? And language like we are one of the best, safest countries for road safety in the world, that we have a war on the motorist narrative, all of which influences whether or not we see road death, road danger reduction as a policy problem. So Kingdom suggests that there is an order in terms of problem, policy and politics in the 3 streams. And I'm kind of going to do them in the wrong order, and you'll understand why in a minute, why I've chosen to do that. So I'm going to do policy solutions first. So what I argue in my thesis is that we basically know what to do. Whether you support safe systems, Vision Zero as language or as concepts, within those, there is a ton of evidence over many decades that tell us what sort of things work, whether that's making infrastructure safer, whether that's managing speed, whether that's well, there's a whole raft of things like alcohol and drugs and casualty reduction targets. And one of my own personal interests is in the graduate driving licensing systems, which have been proven to save up to 40% of those impacted by young driver crashes. So there are a number of different policy solutions that are still available to us, have been available to us in some cases over many, many decades. And not to oversimplify too much, but I essentially say that they form into 2 categories. The first category is that those policy solutions that have been acceptable, that have been agreed, that are relatively uncontroversial solutions have essentially been implemented over a long period of time. There is a debate in some of them as to whether their efficacy is strong enough. So I will use the Think campaigns as an example. The evidence behind the Think campaigns isn't that strong. And there are others that have been implemented that make political points. And I think given the audience today, I will mention the death by dangerous cycling, Ian Smith thing that happened over the last couple of months. So there are elements of government priorities that do get fed through that and either end up in policy, or certainly with that example potentially would have done. I think it got thrown out because of the general election, but I'm sure you'll tell me whether that's right or not. And then there's another group, which are those that are deemed to be, and these are very subjective terms, whether they are unacceptable, controversial to whom. A lot of them, in terms of speed management, have been deemed within the literature that I've looked at Hansard particularly, as too costly, so therefore we can't do them. And not delivered, even though that's where the data takes you. So I will use two examples, one of which is rural roads, which is one of my chapters in my thesis, which is where 60% of road deaths happen, often with vulnerable road users, and a significant number of young drivers are killed or seriously injured, or the people who they kill and seriously injured as a result of their car crashes. And the other example I would use is the whole kind of the new business models around the gig economy, or the whole introduction of electronic cycles and mopeds, and how we've essentially just kind of ignored all of that risk. And even though there's increasing evidence, increasing numbers of people being killed or seriously injured, have been discounted or ignored. So the bit I wanted to focus on, I didn't look at the clock when I started talking, so I'm sure Robin will tell me when I get near the end. The bit I wanted to focus on was the problem and the politics. So what I basically argue in my work is that between 1987 and about 2002, the policy problem was accepted. Policy solutions were available. The politicians at the time accepted those policy solutions, and the politics and the debate and the discourse within Parliament and within the documents that I've referenced essentially were very supportive. Obviously, there will be debate and argument within the House of Commons, which is what they're there for, but it's also understandable. But essentially, the 1987 and the 2000 policy documents, both of which were developed as a result of cross-government involvement and included kind of high-level senior ministerial leadership, accountability frameworks, governance structures, things like casualty reduction targets. And as a result of both of those, from 87 to 2000 and from 2000 to about 2010, there were significant reductions in those killed or seriously injured. Behind that assumption, that finding, is a lot of evidence in terms of the chronology. One little item which probably illustrates it quite well today is that Hansard helpfully categorizes the nature of a debate. So they go from business questions, which are really quick and rapid, all the way through to a full-blown half-day debate, sometimes a full day. So it's difficult to do quantitative analysis in this space. Most of my work was qualitative. But one example is that I think it's something like 80% of the major road safety, and they are called road safety within Hansard policy debates, happened prior to 2003. Since 2003, there's been 20% relatively significantly less. And the other part is that from 2003 to 2021, which at the end of 2021, where my research period ended, although I stand by my conclusion into where we are today in 2024, we basically haven't seen road safety as a policy problem. And because of that, policy solutions, although there have been examples of solutions that have been implemented, and they haven't tackled the seriousness of the numbers of people killed or seriously injured particularly over the last 20 years. Now, there are different periods within that, and therefore different reasons why that might be the case. So in the earlier part, there was a lot of activity, a lot of leadership, and a lot of things, if I can use really kind of shorthand, happened after the 2000 policy document, including speed management, and there's a really good associated document that goes with that on how to manage speed. So there is a sense that the Blair government thought, well, we've kind of fixed this, haven't we? We put all that effort in, and the numbers are coming down. So there was very little policy activity from a strategic point of view, although there were areas where there were specific modal motorcycles, for example, would be a best example, over that period. And then from the coalition government all the way through to today, the policy problem has basically seen, well, we're one of the best in the world. The numbers are coming down, aren't they? It's only 5 a day that are people who are killed on our roads, and therefore the policy problem hasn't been seen as being relevant. And certainly in the kind of the Johnson, Truss, Sunak government, it's kind of disappeared, other than the plan for drivers, which I guess you'll be very familiar as well for all the wrong reasons. So that it's always difficult to oversimplify in terms of two very clear periods of time with a very clear finding between them. But I'm very confident that there's significant data and evidence behind both of those in order to come to those findings. I would say I have focused on agenda setting, which is really quite important. So that's not saying things didn't happen in terms of policy implementation, particularly over the latter end of the 2000s, but there's also been things happening in the 2010s. I'm much more focused in agenda setting in terms of what things were at the front end of the policy cycle. I think that's an important distinction. So my discussion is heavily biased towards the politics of this, about power, about political choices, about what motivates those political choices. One of the very strong pieces of, I'll just illustrate a few, I can't obviously cover it all. The lens through which we look at this is kind of summarized very nicely by the work of Ian Walker, Adrian Davis, and I can't remember the third person, the kind of the motor norm activity that he talked about in terms of the lens through which policymakers look at the risk that we've got, the policy problem of people being killed or seriously injured on our roads, and policies made through that lens. Right up to date, there's a debate that's current. Louise Hay from Labour and Mark Harper, Conservative Party, competing for the driver vote. And some of that's Louise Hay talking about a laser-like focus on the cost of driving, and obviously there's a plan for drivers from the Conservatives. So that's that space where there's so many people who use our road, but actually it's got very narrowly focused, I would argue, in a very disproportionate space in terms of drivers. So that's all about the rise in libertarian politics. And if I just go slightly off script I personally have been very, very disappointed with the Labour Party and the Green Party by not actually having road danger anywhere near their manifestos. And then to read what Louise Hay has been talking about this week has been very disappointing. So back onto the script in terms of the academic work. The framing or the sense the job has been done was very, very strong.
Just a prompt on time, Ian.
How many minutes? 2, 3?
Couple of minutes to wrap up. Yep.
Perfect timing. Then I've just got the conclusion to do. So the framing of this is really very powerful. If I would just very quickly use smoking as a kind of very topical or historically topical example, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, smoking was framed, described, shown, Hollywood glamour, different sort of language to how it's framed now. Argue that the framing and how the policy image is presented within road danger reduction, often by using the word road safety, which is in academia, in the media, it's all over the place. And actually that in of itself is part of the problem. So thank you, Robin. Helpfully, I've come to the conclusion. So I have skimmed my work, and I hope I've drawn out things that are a little bit controversial, possibly, or certainly things that will stimulate some conversation and debate. I would argue that we've got a significant problem with framing and language, as I've just said. But I do wonder whether some of that is a little bit of a distraction that can potentially divide us. So while we are divided, we're not united as a tribe in road danger reduction. I think we've been overly focused on what we do. So one of my supervisors, Greg at Marsden, did a piece of work that argued that from transport policy perspective, there's a significant proportion of what we do rather than how we do it. So I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we need to focus much more on how we get people, politicians, policymakers to focus much more on road danger, road death, and then how we achieve change. And my basic conclusion, the headline of the thesis is twofold. Firstly, we did reduce road death very significantly with a whole raft of reasons why we did that and factors that contributed. But actually, over the last 20 years, we basically kicked the policy can down the road. And the result is that we've had policy stability. The number of people who are killed or seriously injured on our roads hasn't really changed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
I can't see anybody's faces, so I have no idea how that went down.
Let's put us back into the group. Thank you very much. I think that was a really interesting discussion, and it's good to have it from a very much a policy and a kind of strategic overall perspective. And I've immediately got a couple of thoughts. I think it's worth talking about the policy and the strategic aspects. There's some questions about naturally with this audience, there's questions about detail and numbers and data and things like that as well. But I suggest we talk about the policy and strategy because that's where you've focused tonight. And I've got two thoughts. My first thought was when you were talking about the things that have happened. So I'm a business consultant, so I immediately think about 2x2 matrices and things like that. And what you described to me was, oh, it's going to blur.
Yeah, it's very blurred.
No, that's no good.
Yeah.
So it's because I've got blurred background on. It's a 2x2 matrix of what's acceptable.
Okay. Yeah.
Are things acceptable? Are things effective? And what you're saying is the things that have been done on the basis of whether they're acceptable or not, nothing to do with whether they're effective or not, which was really interesting. But then your approach you described as agenda setting. And that's really interesting because what you're doing is you're appealing to people's values, and you're not saying, well, we've got to block off this street or reduce this speed limit and these things that are going to be a pain for you. You're saying we've got to stop killing these children, and things like that, and these injuries can't carry on happening. And this person was maimed in this terrible collision. We've got to stop that. And you're focusing on the things that matter to people, and let's get and I think essentially building agreement around that. And then once I don't know, I may be putting things, maybe this is the way you're thinking or not, but build momentum around that, and then that will carry it through, hopefully, the more painful more difficult things that need to happen to make it happen. Is that a conscious decision? Is that how you're thinking? That's what I wanted to get to.
Entering into this bit, Robin, can I just say that I other than my slight straying into a personal view partway through the presentation, it was basically that's what the data tells us in the presentation. I will slightly stray into interpreting that now and add some views of my own into this part of the conversation. So the language thing, the killing children on our streets question that you've just posed, I think yes. It's simply yes. The answer is yes. How different people involved in this space describe what it is we're trying to do, I think directly influences the outcome. So if I watched the whole London debate prior to the Uxbridge by-election and all that went with that, and I know it's happening in other cities, I'm not going to mention Oxford particularly, but the kind of the whole narrative and the whole discourse gets polarized. Mm-hmm. and I think there's two things from my point of view. The academic stuff does tell you that the policy image is really very important, and if policy entrepreneurs, to use some of the language, those who are in the lobbying space, they deliberately use, and it's a tactic that's well researched and well written about, they deliberately use language in order to split or to cause division or to present their particular perspective. So we know that there are millions of pounds poured in by the car, oil, gas industries into Parliament policy making. And you'll notice that language is a key part of what then follows from that. Yeah. So my argument is, therefore, if you can be really clear which language you are using, that is much more, it's not necessarily emotional. You asked about emotional. It's not necessarily emotional, but it's much more attuned to what it is that we're trying to do. So my campaigning is to stop road death. Really simple, really clear language. I don't campaign for road safety. I campaign to stop road death. And that is a deliberate part based on my own experience, but also my academic work. So the other part was about your little grid, the kind of the effectiveness versus acceptability. Well, I quite like the simplicity of what you've done, but it's obviously, it would be a 3D version. So that the whole thing about people bang on about policy, about evidence-based policy making. And What I would argue, and it's part of what my thesis says, and others, is that if you have the evidence behind you, that is absolutely no guarantee that you will get what evidence tells you. One of the mistakes, my academic colleagues don't like me saying this, but one of the mistakes a lot of academics will make is they go through their methodology and their findings and their results and their conclusions, and it's all brilliant and it's all methodologically sound, and they go, and there's a policy implication. And kind of, well, yeah, so what? So what do we do next? So there's an assumption in academia, but also elsewhere, that if you've got the evidence, you're on the moral high ground, you've got the answer, and you just bang the drum louder and louder and louder and louder until you get the answer that you think that is needed. What I would suggest is that you need to layer in the politics of this. And something it's about the art of the possible, and it's not about being a defeatist, and it's not about giving in, but it's about understanding the language of what might be acceptable to different players, to different parties. And that's why the policy venue side of this is really important. So get the language right in terms of your policy image, what it is that you're aspiring for and wanting to achieve. But also, if you are completely alien to the policy venue, House of Commons, for example, then you're not going to align with what the House of Commons are wanting.
Okay, thank you. Right, David Harrison has had his hand up for a while. I'll take your question, David, and then go to some of the ones on the chat. Oh, you're muted.
Ian, that was marvellous, and I
Thank you.
so thoroughly agree with much of what you're saying. I mean, it is extraordinary that we have failed so miserably and can't even begin to influence bits of the press that might be sympathetic, like the BBC News or the Today programme, all completely ignore this important issue you make. Would you like to say any more about that and attempts that have been made to try and have a bit more impact?
I love your bookcase, by the way. All my books are in a boxes behind me. I'm jealous. So that's a really good question, David. What I didn't do in my thesis was track the evidence behind where there's a connection between the public view, the media view, and how or whether that translates into what politicians, policymakers do. I would love to do that, but I ain't going to do another thesis. So I think there's lots of evidence out there that very definitely connects those three things together. There's some really nice case studies from Holland and from Sweden that do that. But you ask about the media particularly. So it's not something I focused on, as I say. I can give you an example for my own campaigning. I'm a member of a group called Forget Me Not Families Uniting, which is essentially around the death and serious injuries caused by young driver crashes. And what I did in my thesis was I looked back over the decades on young driver policy development. And for road safety, that's what we call it, is a very small part of the transport department. Young driver risk is even a smaller part. So, but having said that, it has had, like the number of deaths that are caused by young drivers, it has had a disproportionate focus over the decades. So we started talking about young driver safety and the risk in 1937. I need to get my teeth in to say that. It was 1937. We started talking about graduated driving licensing, which is a mechanism whereby we manage the licensing process for young people. So they manage transition from being a novice to more experience in 1993. So there have been campaigners in the 80s, 90s, etc., all the way through that have attempted your mobilization, if you like, from the media, have often failed. There's been little episodes. Some of the Transport Committee chairs from the 2000s, Louise, I always forget her surname.
Gwyneth Dunwoody and Louise
Elman, thank you. And yeah, Gwyneth, wow, yes. We're very, very vocal and had big fights with Tony Blair. And that resulted in a kind of a wraparound in terms of the public and the media, none of which have moved anything forward. And what politicians have done, which is why I made the point to Robin about evidence, the evidence for GDL has been around since 1984 when it was implemented in New Zealand. So it's never been about the evidence, but the evidence has been very clear. It's always been about politics.
Yeah.
More recently, Sorry, David. More recent. I'll be a bit quicker. More recently, you mentioned the BBC have been very, very supportive of graduated driving licensing. BBC Breakfast, particularly, have run stories fairly regularly over the last few months. We're starting to gather some momentum, and obviously then the general election happened. I think this is one of the really important things. I didn't mention it in my talks at the time, but if you have the policy image and then you have the wraparound between mobilizing the public, connecting through the media to persuade politicians it's worth the political risk in some of these things, that's where you get results.
Yeah, I was a clerk of the Transport Committee when Gwyneth Dunwoody was chair.
Oh, wow.
And I think the sort of thing to remember about politicians, probably the higher up the food chain they go at the top, they are really listening to the public and the press. So to influence them, you really need to get at the media. And I'm pleased to hear what you say about some of the BBC programmes. I should stop listening to the Today programme, perhaps, and get a more cheerful and useful news station.
There's never a cheerful news station. Is there a reason the government doesn't have a road safety strategy? This is a question from John Morris. And there are no targets for reducing road deaths.
If I was sat in the pub with you, what was the name of the person? Sorry.
John Morris.
John, if I was in the pub, I'd give
John?
you a more candid answer, John.
Was it see above?
Why? It's really interesting. So Jesse Norman was a minister in the mid-2010, and I think did portray his pride to do a lot of good work. So, for example, the Driver 2020 research program came from 2015. So there are other examples. Work on the they call it the Road Safety Investigation Branch. I prefer to call it the Road Crash Investigation Branch. Kind of happened earlier, later in the 2010s. So why? I think a lot of it's to do with the politics that evolved over time. Between the kind of the Blair government and then the coalition government, what I've heard from some people who know what happened because they were there, and I clearly can't name them because they're all confidential. There was a big cull of targets. What was described was the Blair and particularly the Brown governments were all over everything with a target. So what the coalition did was there was a big cull of targets, just generally as a political statement. We're in the new government, we don't want targets. And rather than somebody picking on road casualty reduction targets, what happened is it just got caught up in the big cull. And then we had the Philip Hammond 2011 talking about localism, and you don't need to be told what to do locally, you can do what you want. But we're going to take a load of capital money off you. We're going to take a load of revenue money off. We're going to take your teams off you, and we're not going to set any targets. And we're not going to monitor you. And we're going to take away all the accountability frameworks, and we're going to take away all that governance structure. So I think that is that I can't prove this, and it's something that as an academic, it's really difficult to draw a cause and effect line between one and the other. But those factors, I believe, quite strongly. I've kind of gone into interpreting my own data now, but I do believe it's not in my thesis because it's difficult to prove. But I do believe that there's been a very direct result of policy choices and the politics since 2011, not to prioritise road death, stopping road death, reducing road danger, and therefore, to answer the question, John, that's why we don't have. Although Jesse Norman and others in that space did promise one, we got Baroness Vere, who all kind of tempted us with it, and it's coming, it's written. I know it's written, but they just said no, thank you very much. And then we got Mark Harper and various people who are just not interested. So it's politics.
Right.
If
So
I may,
there's a
Political choice.
Ian, thank you for that. And I just wonder if I can ask for a supplementary. Do you think we should be doing more to try and get on, for example, breakfast TV to actually influence how people feel about deaths on our roads? Because unless we convey these human interest stories, it just statistics people don't seem too worried about.
It's a yes, John, but it's a caveated yes. So if you're interested in the connection between the public, the media, and politicians, there's a really nice paper by a guy called Rhys Hinchcliffe, based on young driver risk in Australia, 2017. You'll find it. It's not him, it's co-authors. He draws very heavily on the influences of of a number of different factors, one of which is the media. But I think there would be a risk of saying, yes, get on the media and everything will be sorted. Not. What he says and his co-authors say, basically, if you have the evidence base, if you have the support from health organisations, which the UK health organisations are not active in this space, which is one of our biggest weaknesses, I would suggest, and you get the usual suspects within the road danger reduction, wanting to stop road death tribe space, you are more likely to get politicians to listen to you. The reason politicians started to listen, I think, is because of the BBC Breakfast campaign. They wouldn't call it a campaign, but I was included in the stuff that they did. I think they've done it 7 times now in the last 3 or 4 months. That did start to change the debate. It did start to alter the discourse. It did start to get, so MP called Kim Leadbeater presented a 10-minute motion. I am focusing a lot on young drivers because that's what I've spent my time in the last few months focusing on. So John, I do think media attention framed in the correct way, rather than battling between different tribes, is absolutely the right way forward. If you've got the wraparound of public support and the right language and media interest.
Right, thank you. We're going to have to bring this session to a close, but I will ask: you've got a thesis? I know it's a kind of multi-volume or multi-section thing. Is it available for people to study, or is there a form in which people can look at it?
There's something in West Yorkshire called the White Rose Thesis Deposit Scheme, or I can't remember the exact words, but it'll come up because there's not very many things called that.
Okay.
And it's in there, it's publicly available, or it will be. And if you want it now and it's not quite released, they send me a little email and I can release it. I have written I'm aiming to do 4 papers. I've written 1, but I'm in the academic mire of publication with peer review and all of that stuff. So
okay,
there will be 1 paper that is in the sausage machine fairly soon, I hope. And if anybody's desperate to read that, I'm happy to share it by book. If you can track me down, I'm not releasing my email, so there you go. Maybe Twitter or LinkedIn.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. That was a really super fascinating talk, and it's a topic we'll come back to again and again. But I think we take out of that there's a change of government. There's an opportunity to influence on this topic, and there's a lot of people here who will join you in getting the campaign in a non-divisive way to support action on reducing danger, reducing deaths on the roads. And that I think keeping that pressure up is the way to go about it.
Just one final comment, Robin, very, very quickly. I've read all the manifestos and there's very little on road danger and road death. Disappointingly, I'm told by, I'm not going to name them, but I'm told by one party that they were caught on the hop because they had a process that was going to be 3 months to be ready for the autumn, but they intended to have it in there. Labour is just not there. It's just invisible. So my final point would be, don't assume that you have a ally in the current manifestos or those that have written them.
Yeah.
Depressingly.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, thanks again, Ian. So now we'll switch to our second topic for the night. Mark, Ranty Highwayman, with the good, the bad and the interesting. I see you fired up your presentation, Mark. And what are you telling us about tonight?
Well, thank you, Robin, and evening from a sweltering London. So, carrying on from tonight's theme and the theme of my last little run through. So we did Vision Zero in Sweden a few weeks ago. Tonight we are heading across the North Sea to Netherlands. And so to carry on the theme that Ian's just been through, let's start with something that I imagine lots of people have heard of. Stop the Kindermoord in Netherlands, stop the child murder. But I'm going to talk about actually where the Dutch probably got more to grips on how they deal with road danger reduction, Vision Zero, road safety, whatever people want to call it tonight. The Dutch call it sustainable safety, and I shall explain why. But I thought it was worth touching on the 1970s first. So, as I say, lots of people have heard of this. The origin of this particular movement was back from 1972. There was a journalist called Vic Langenhoff, whose 6-year-old daughter was killed in 1971. And this was actually the start of a series of articles that he wrote. But his very first article, which was about Stop the Child Murder, was actually demanding that school buses are used to get children safely to school. So this was nothing to do with cycling or walking or anything else. It was about buses are the safest way of getting children to school. And you have to remember the backdrop to this at the time was lots of car expansion. We were still before the oil crisis in 1973. And so people's minds hadn't really changed about what was going to happen. Driving was becoming progress. So he said, the ignorance, carelessness, or cynicism with which priorities are set in this country must end. This is not about a peripheral phenomenon. It's about the question of whether we wish to be a civilized people. And that was kind of the thing that kicks off the whole idea of change in the Netherlands. So that was 1972 when he wrote that. Then we had 20 years in the Netherlands of all sorts of things. There was campaigning, and the Kindermoed changed and adapted and developed in that time. There was lots of research, there was innovation. I'm just going to shut the door. There we go. And there was this whole idea of the traffic system itself is the issue, and it comes from the feeling of unsafety, which is a bit unfamiliar in terms of the English language, but that was kind of the Dutch approach to this. And we're talking about the era of the WUNEF. So this is Westerstraat in Delft, which is one of the very original 1970s demonstration projects. And in the photograph, when I took it a couple of years back, it actually just been completely repaved, but they'd largely kept the layout the same, but it's traffic filters, and WUNEFs really are a low traffic core within a much bigger low traffic neighborhood. So that's where that idea came from, but it was never really organized at a national scale. So 1992, 20 years after, the ideas crystallized into the system the Dutch have today, which is called Sustainable Safety. It's currently in its 3rd edition, and it's looking at the 2018 to 2030 horizon for their road traffic system. And we keep coming back to road traffic system in this. The whole idea of sustainable comes from the 1987 Brundtland report, Our Common Future. Defined sustainable development in this case as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And from a sustainable safety point of view, this is basically, let's design out problems today so that people in the future don't have to deal with them, spend time, resources, effort, people getting hurt and the rest of it. Let's get it right now is what we're saying. So that's where sustainable safety comes from as a term. We've got 5 principles. The first 3 are design-led, so that's under the control of people like me and how things are organised. So they looked at the functionality of the roads, biomechanics, and this is about the differences in speed, direction, mass, size, all those kind of things. Psychologics, that's about how people are influenced through the road environment they see. And then from the organisation point of view, this is allocating responsibility to the right person or people, and then very importantly, learning and innovating, and in some ways not being too afraid of getting things wrong, have to go back and do it again. So that's the Dutch road safety principles, and they call it road safety, even going back to 1992. So there will be some pictures in a minute, but there's a bit of text to get through just to set the scene here. So on the functionality, the Dutch have 3, well actually have 4, or maybe even 5 if you want to push it, but types of road. And what they do at the national level is mandate to authorities, they have to decide what each road is for. So a through road carries a flow function. That includes across intersections and through junctions. You could argue that motorways are probably a slightly special case outside of this, but it's at the top end of a through road. They've put some numbers on it here. All AADT means is an average 24-hour flow. Then you've got below that distributor roads, which have a flow function on the roads themselves, and a really interesting term called exchange at intersections, and that's because people interact, and we have to manage how they interact at those particular points of conflict. And then at the other end of the scale, access roads, these are about exchanges. So this is where people really are mixing, low traffic flows, less than 2,000 vehicles a day. We'll come back to that figure in a second. So where you've got a road that you're struggling to classify because of what it's doing now or what it might do in the future, the Dutch have this term called a grey road. They've got multiple uses. There's lots of conflicts going on, and very often they're city streets, so very difficult to retrofit. It's very challenging in urban areas. And again, this comes from the principles around motor traffic flows, traffic speeds, that kind of thing. And so in terms of grey roads, what the Dutch tend to do with those is come to a compromised position and do the best they can with it at the time. And potentially in the future, they're going to redesign their traffic system that particular road becomes one or the other, often being downgraded in inverted commas to the lower type of road. So that's enough of the text. Let's look at a couple of examples. So here's Weesperweg in North Holland. This is on the far outskirts of Amsterdam. You're beyond the sort of the rural fringe here. The actual road with the buses, 80 kilometers an hour, 50 miles an hour, and walking and cycling is completely separated from road traffic. You've got some pretty meaty crash barriers there, probably more about stopping vehicles getting down onto the motorway that this is actually crossing here. The motorway is crossing 130 kilometers an hour, 80 mile an hour speed limit. So this very much is performing a through function, as is the motorway below. Then we have Koolsingel in Rotterdam, which is a fascinating project here. So this would have been a proper through route previously. Dual carriageway, pretty busy. The city basically took one whole carriageway and converted that into a cycleway. There's trams that run up the middle. So it's a completely different feel for what it's doing. So through design, this is now a distributor road. It actually has a 50 kilometer an hour speed limit, although the signs locally recommend 30. But it's a bit of a weird advisory thing the Dutch have going on here. However, because we still have lots of traffic over on the left-hand side, you can just see a lorry, still a fair amount of traffic trying to get to other places within the city, big vehicles. We have protection for vulnerable users. So there's still traffic signals to manage the traffic flow, crossings, all this kind of thing. The trams are slightly a red herring from that point of view because they tend to operate on their own system within the city. And then let's go into Oud Kerkstraat in Delft, which is very much an access road. If you have to take a motor vehicle here, and that's only at certain parts of the day for deliveries or access, you very much are a guest. So 30 kilometers an hour, 20 miles an hour, everybody mixes and gets on with it. So that's kind of where lots of places in city centres are in the Netherlands now. Just an example. Now, I've not found any official description of this one, but I'm going to say this is a grey road. There's a few clues here. So this is, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. This is next to the, you can just see out of shot on the right-hand side. This is the motorway they converted back to a canal on the city ring, on the edge of Utrecht. On this particular street, if you go in one particular direction out of the city a bit further, you actually get some cycle tracks appearing, and there's lots of use of traffic signals, so it becomes definitely distributor road. But here it's trying to perform a bit of an access function in terms of the cycling, a bit of a distributor function because in the distance there's accesses to car parks and other parts of Utrecht city centre. But the clues here about why this is a bit of a fudge is you've got the fairly wide cycle lanes. They're pretty nice to use. You haven't got a centre line. Traffic is kind of pushed to the middle, goes into the cycle lanes when it has to get past each other. But from the cycling perspective, that can feel quite uncomfortable. Seeing what Utrecht is doing, eventually this will become an access road. So this is one of these, yeah, in limbo roads, if you want to call it that, but probably a bit too busy to be mixing with traffic, really. However, there is a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. As I say, some of these features to try and act as a compromise. So biomechanics, this is about the level of protection the human body requires in the event of a collision, and engineering the layout of the highway to regulate appropriate speeds. So fast-flowing traffic layouts have things split apart. And when I talked about Vision Zero the other week, this is about traffic coming towards each other at speed, is separated with crash barriers down the middle, all this kind of thing. So we talk about traffic in all of its senses here, and those carrying the most mass and therefore energy into the system are separated from everybody else. I often say on Twitter, physics and biomechanics don't care. This is the biomechanics part of it. So here's a few things about survivability, maybe, appropriate speeds for such. So if you're in a position where you've got traffic, as in motor traffic and pedestrians, you really want motorists to be driving very, very slowly. That's at the top end there, 15 kilometers an hour. This is not speed limits. This is about design speeds. If you go all the way to the other end, we're talking about there's no vulnerable road users around. You're not going to have traffic crossing at right angles to each other. You've got no oncoming traffic collisions because you have these separate carriageways, this kind of thing. This is motorway territory. And then we've got steps in between there. This is probably familiar then. So I mentioned 2,000 vehicles a day, AADT. There you go. There's the 2,000 there in LTM 120. The box up on the top right here, this is the condition within which most people are probably happy with mixing with traffic up to 20 miles an hour. So none of this is new. We go and steal everybody else's ideas. So the Dutch have thought about this. We've just gone in and grabbed it. Psychologics, this is about does the road layout align with what people expect? There is some training in there. There's some vehicle technology, but let's look at a quick example. 2 streets, about 15 meters wide. Top left is suburban London. Bottom right is on the edge of Deventer, on what passes as a ring road or inner ring road for that particular city. 2 different messages here. You can see for yourself, top left, it's, yeah, you're separated from oncoming traffic, stick your foot down, people are out your way. Bottom right in Netherlands, well, there are people here walking, there's people here cycling. It's a pretty narrow carriageway. This I think was about 5 meters wide. So as a driver, you are going to slow down. So 2 different messages, same street width. And responsibility, that's really about the government being ultimately responsible for how things work in the country, but roads authorities have responsibility. And then at the operational level, professionals doing their jobs. Netherlands has a debate about where the state should prescribe things and people's ability to choose behaviour, going back to what we heard a little while ago about the libertarian approach, but there needs to be a system that forgives people when they make mistakes. Now, we're not talking about people who are criminals, are determined to speed and get drunk and the rest of it. This is people, lapse of concentrations, the thing that humans do. So people shouldn't get hurt because of the road system. Then on learning and innovation, they use the deeming cycle of plan, do, check and act. Gets a bit academic here, I think, for some of this are a bit more practical, but essentially it's just saying, look, plan what you're going to do it, monitor it, and then come back and do some revisions based on what you found in your monitoring and evaluation. And then start again, plan your next thing and keep going, keep going. So that's why the Dutch are always tinkering, always improving. They're quite happy to run experimental traffic schemes just to see how they work and to learn from those. So 2 more slides you'll be glad to hear. So let's look at some of the issues and debate around sustainable safety. It is a motor traffic centric approach because we're looking at numbers of motor vehicles in terms of flows, speeds, that kind of thing, and almost designing the system off the back of that. Maybe that needs to be turned on its head a little bit more. We have this big challenge here of grey roads. I would say UK equivalent of a grey road is an A road high street, urban high street, which has a very, very busy flow function, but this exchange function of people shopping, crossing the road, cycling, all the rest of it. So we've got the same kind of problems as the Dutch. And we've also got the issue here, potentially, I mean, not so much in the UK, but certainly in some cities we might be starting to have this, is very, very heavy volumes of cycling, creating similar issues for cars as cars, not so much the noise and the extreme road danger, but people feeling intimidated by lots and lots of cyclists coming through, difficulty in crossing the road, maybe some of the parking that we see with hire bikes. So let's not make the same mistakes that we did for motor traffic with cycle traffic is the warning there. And then finally, we've got the rise of e-cycles and speed pedelecs, and that's had some impact in the Netherlands about single person crashes, especially older people, especially with e-cycles. Classic example of what the Dutch are trying to get rid of now. At the bottom there, bollards, people keep crashing into them and hurting themselves. And the older you are, the more likely you are to come off badly from it. There's also then this whole debate about consistency versus distinctiveness. So if everything looks the same, that's fantastic from the point of view. Yes, I expect to behave in a certain way in this street environment, but actually, does that cause a problem for your local distinctiveness that you might want to do something different there? Then the resources to deliver. All this stuff takes time, money, people to get right. There you go, Robin. Very, very quick. Not much time left, but do we have any quick questions?
Thank you, Mark. That was really good, really interesting run through the history of the Dutch approach, and then see you linked it brilliantly to how it plays out in practice as you do. Any questions? Any comments?
Everyone's tired.
Is that Tim from Leicester with a question from his garden?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
And then one from Graham. Yes.
Really interesting evening. Thank you for that. I picked up that the Dutch have suddenly decided everybody has to wear a helmet if they get on a bicycle. I'm sure Ruth has got the answer to this, but is that's another session, I know. But I just wondered if you had some insider knowledge.
I don't really. I mean, I've probably read the same as everybody else. But what I'd be saying is this is to some extent a reaction to some of the faster cycling. So again, the rise of e-cycles and especially speed pedelecs. And then you've got lots of older people cycling. And there's a whole debate about balance here, that you have a society who's fit, healthy, and active far, far longer than, say, the UK. But in the process of doing this, there are some people getting themselves quite badly hurt, because it doesn't take a lot to hurt yourself. Some people hurt themselves if they fall off their bike there. So again, I think it's almost a knee-jerk reaction. Well, that's the bit that gets injured badly, but potentially it's things like hips and bones, maybe just as bad. But do you want a society who can be independent and healthy and the rest of those things as long as possible, or do you want them to stop cycling? And there's a whole load of other societal issues that come with that by not being fit and independent.
Right. We're coming very close to time. So Graham, have you got the quick one?
Yeah, Mark, I don't know whether you saw the presentation that Patrick Lingwood and I did a few months ago now, I think, on that focused largely on the Catherine signal and other examples in Utrecht. I know that we have been treading in each other's footsteps on the way around, but it was presented to me by a mature person on the scene that the Catherine signal moved to that, what we would call advisory, away from cycle tracks in that section. In fact, the whole of the inner canal ring section, because they felt that motorists didn't see cyclists, and that in a perverse way, it was a shocking thing. But Patrick and I spent, as you probably did too, many hours observing the Catherine signal with all kinds of users and ages, and came to the conclusion that it seemed to be pretty near wonderful if you had to have a mix. Anyway, I better shut up.
Yeah, I mean, that particular Utrecht is really interesting because they've got lots of things going on, lots of experiments. And it's okay, yeah, cycle tracks, the advisory lanes like that, cycle streets as well going on. I would say that particular section, I mean, when I was there, it felt a bit busy, but probably the rest of the infrastructure dealt with that as a bit of a weaker link. Some of the cycle streets as well, probably a bit too much traffic in there. So I think that will probably evolve and probably change over time. But again, they're not afraid to give it a go, really, which is fine. We tend to want to build a thing and leave it and never change it again, or admit mistakes even.
Yeah. I mean, the Dutch have been working on that for 30 years, to my knowledge. I've seen it in different states, and I was gobsmacked, to be honest, when I saw they've gone from tracks to shared in this specific location.
Yeah, it's unusual. H, you'll have to be really quick.
Will be, Robin. I'm thinking Mark would know chapter 5 and road science, where we have lead-ins and white line markings so that guide people to avoid crashing into things. And I think some Dutch bollards have got this now. Is there something in the design and the geometry of cycle paths which can actually make people psychologically take the right route and slow down? Because I know there's that issue with rails to trails back in 1996, that there was a specific radius that you would put in to keep cycle speeds down. And I built cycle tracks that wiggle because people slow down.
That might be more specific than we want to handle.
Well, I suppose the general point there is, I mean, the Dutch have picked up as single person collisions with bollards, and they have tried really long tapers with white paint to try and highlight them. But it's obviously not working because you're seeing increasingly more and more being taken out. And if there's areas where you've got drivers trying to sneak through for whatever reason, you're starting to see a few more cameras. So yeah, we just need to design out stuff to crash into is the general approach, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk of that. Brian Deegan has a presentation on cycling mixed with pedestrians, and one of the things in it, the first principle is clarity breeds speed, and you've got to think about where speed is important and where not crashing into and being slow is more important, and design for purpose. Yeah,
we need. I mean, the Dutch.
But anyway, that's another episode, isn't it?
The behaviour, yeah. So yeah, I think there's a lot in that.
That set you up for another episode, Mark. Good, and I must bring us to an end here. We could go on all night, as many of us would be tempted to do if we were down a real pub. But we are only at a virtual pub, and I must pull the plug. And thank you very much, Ian Greenwood, for that really interesting talk about something that is a tragic, it's a tragic but really important issue to grapple on and make set our mind to the political wheel. Thank you, Mark, for another fascinating talk, linking from that topic onto infrastructure. Next week, we have Eleanor Rofe and Emma Lawler talking about their research on interventions that increase active travel. So right on point for our topic. The week after that, we've got Laura Laker talking about her new book, Potholes and Pavements. I expect at least half of us have already read it. And in the meantime, have an excellent rest of the evening, and have a good week after that. I'll see you again soon.